Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to the last event of the Oxford Queer Studies Network, for this term at least. We're here to talk about different spectrality in Call Me By Your Name with Sergio Rigoletto. Sergio Rigoletto has a joint appointment in the Departments of Cinema Studies and Romance Languages at the University of Oregon. His research explores the relation between social change and media aesthetics, especially cinema and TV. He's written extensively on queer cinemas, film stardom and performance, international television, film costume, and many aspects of Italian cinema. He's the author of 2 monographs, Masculinity and Italian Cinema, Sexual Politics, Social Conflict, and Male Crisis in the 1970s, published in 2014. And I have it here, le norme traviate, saggi sul genere, sulla sessualità nel cinema e nella televisione italiana. He has co-edited a book entitled Popular Italian Cinema and is currently working on 2 book projects, a monograph on actress Anna Magnani and a volume provisionally titled Queer from the South, Film, Visual Art, and Media Activism in the Mediterranean. So how we're going to proceed is that Sergio is going to give his presentation for approximately half an hour. If you have any questions, just put it in the Q&A chat or just ask them directly once we'll stop recording after his presentation. Just raise your hand and we'll make you a presenter. Sergio, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for this introduction, Alice, and thank you everyone for this invitation. So something I'm really interested is in how things change over time. When I was growing up in the 80s, really the homosexual characters that I would find in film and television were mainly, people you would laugh at. And Italy has a big tradition of film comedy, so we're the quite big sample of these figures. Now I go on Netflix and I find all these new series with gay characters that we may understand simplistically as positive. So for the kid who grew up in the 80s and 90s, it's a strange experience. Kind of unsettling as well to see this process of normalization of queer lives on screen. And I guess that's the case for those of us who still carry the historical memory of that not so distant injury. So today I would like to talk about a film, Call Me By Your Name, that seems to me very much about the present, or rather of the present. A present in which films with same-sex stories win Oscars, they can do well at the box office, and so on. And of course, Call Me By Your Name is not just a film of the present. Its setting in the 80s invites us, in a way, to think about the relation between the present that we inhabit and the past, right? And the 80s is a very painful past for queers. So in this sense, we may want to think of Call Me By Your Name together with other recent films that turn their gaze to this not so distant past. So films like Christophe Honoré's Sorry Angel, Françoise Ozon, Summer 85, Robin Campillo's 120 beats per minute, that's more like the 90s. Lucio Castro's End of Centuries, again, the historical setting for this film is more the 90s. And we could also add It's a Sin, right? The TV series that you must know very well. Why am I putting them all together? Because all these films and this series seem to interrogate from a particular male and gay perspective this kind of presumed affective gap and the distinct modes of consciousness separating the present from that different point in history, so 80s and 90s. So I began thinking about Call Me By Your Name because of a recurring motif in the reviews and in the debates surrounding the film. It's something that was repeatedly, almost obsessively said. So the refrain goes as follows. It informs the reader that Call Me By Your Name is a homosexual love story between two men, but that this detail is of little importance because after all, it's a universal story. And of course, it's not the first time that we hear the claim of universality for a film with some kind of homosexual plot line that aspires to do well at the box office. But I think there is more. I will share my screen now because I have a couple of quotes. So in her review of the film, Serena Nannelli writes, the story at the center of the scene is between two men, but in essence, it is universal and told with such delicacy that anyone could identify with it. And then we have Peter Travers, who says, the movie is bound to be compared to such recent gay landmarks as Brokeback Mountain, Carol, and Moonlight. But this masterpiece goes its own transcendent way. With Oliver, Elio feels he can talk about things that matter. The beauty part is that these things matter to all of us, regardless of sexual orientation. So it's difficult not to infer in Nannelli's and Travers' words, the impression that a homosexual love story is by definition of little interest to the larger public, which is here imagined as generally heterosexual. So according to Nannelli and Travers, Call Me By Your Name transcends its own specificity, a specificity which would be, according to them, only relevant to a homosexual public on the basis of a register of identification that is universally inclusive. Travers says these things matter to all of us. So here's the question: what is left of this specificity when reduced to a level of universal irrelevance? And what is its value? Now, recognition of a universal experience in a film that deals with same-sex romance would seem to be this kind of proof of a new era of liberal benevolence, acceptance for LGBT experiences, often on the screen. Universal claims, however, often turn out to be universalizing claims. They're usually driven by this desire to bypass specificity, particularism, and yet, these proclamations do not have a purely descriptive kind of function, but instead really produce the very conditions that they claim to describe. So in this case, they produce the idea that certain differences are irrelevant, and what really counts is humankind's shared commonality. Now, I think it would be too simple to just criticize these statements in order to show the exclusions, the silences, which are concealed behind what is presented as universal. But rather, it's worth asking if Call Me By Your Name can be considered a universal, a story with a universal value in another sense. So not for the irrelevance of homosexuality, but for the constitutive function that homosexuality plays in the film's articulation of a universal story or a universal fantasy. Depends on your take. You know, you may be skeptical about universal stories or even annoyed by the very idea of a universal story. If that's the case, at least let's accept that this is the kind of story that Call Me By Your Name may be trying to tell. And I will get back to this point. Call Me By Your Name has been repeatedly acclaimed for how it would seem to break with a series of habitual narrations about homosexual experience. Narrations that are tied to prejudice, discrimination, and so on. I will share again the screen. So on the pages of Out, Bret Easton Ellis writes, Call Me By Your Name can easily be heralded as a post-gay movie because it's not about AIDS or bullying or politics or being a victim. There's no one to hide from, no punishment, no suffering. So by using this category of post-gay, Easton Ellis seems to suggest that Call Me By Your Name belongs to a new era, right? An era in which homosexuals no longer have to fight to affirm the legitimacy of their lives or their choices. A film where two men can simply love each other, right? Like anyone else. So for Easton Ellis, he's not the only one who's making such an argument. Call Me By Your Name constitutes a clean break with the past. And the evidence for this would be the way in which the film liberates itself from the ghosts that have historically defined homosexual experiences in the cinema. The closet, coming out, fear of not being accepted, AIDS, etc. This is, again, a shared sentiment in the reception of the film. That's why it's important to take it seriously. Now, the opinion that Call Me By Your Name represents a clean break with the past obviously requires caution. You know, above all, when one sort of conjures up ghosts. You know, clearly it would be foolish to think that we can leave the ghost behind or that we can forget about them. This would be to misunderstand the ghost. And here, I think, you know, it's in my opinion, that the category of the spectral really invites us to interrogate the relation between the present that Call Me By Your Name has been called on to represent and the past from which the film would seem to have moved away. So let's see how Call Me By Your Name tries to tell a universal story. So a story in which differences may be irrelevant or not very interesting. Many of the enthusiastic reactions to the film suggest that Elio's emotional distress is a situation that pertains to everyone without distinction of time or place. Elio is the teenager played by Timothée Chalamet. A universal experience often presents itself as a timeless experience. And it's in this way that a considerable segment of critics have read young Elio's emotional struggle. A timeless experience must also be universalized on a spatial level, its spatial specificity being diluted and elevated to a level of generality. The film is set in this villa in the countryside of Lombardy. The film begins with a general kind of spatial note somewhere in northern Italy. The note seemed to suggest to the audience that the local specificity of the setting kind of contains little importance, because the actual location of the Perlman family's villa may be an ideal world, an ideal place outside of reality. So Call Me By Your Name seems to present to the spectator a fantasy suspended in time and abstracted from a concrete dimension, even though there are some references in the dialogue to one city, at least, Crema, which is in the surrounding. So in this sense, the Italy that we see in this film is very much an idealized Italy. And people have written about this, D.A. Miller, for example. So a fantastic projection tied to a certain kind of sensibility and aesthetic taste. One that nourishes itself on classical echoes, Heraclitus, the bronzes from the Hellenistic age, pederasty, as well as on humanistic sources, Michel de Montaigne, Marguerite de Navarre, Marcel Proust. So through these classical and humanistic references, Call Me By Your Name seems animated by a kind of push, a push to universalize the experience of homosexual desire. How? By assimilating it to a formal system where that desire would seem to naturally belong. However, this is, in my opinion, an effort that betrays, in part, its own preconditions. A condition that the film is not really able to eliminate, re-emerges out of this or from this universalizing impulse. And there is really the stubborn resurfacing of homosexual desire as a figure of difference, one that threatens this kind of idealized imaginary. And it's a threat that seems to materialize itself in the form kind of a spectral presence. So in our current era of equality legislations and queer-friendly Netflix series, this juxtaposition between homosexuality and difference may feel kind of anachronistic. The gesture seems to go against a present tense narrative that is especially prominent in the global north, a collective mode of consciousness that revolves around the feeling of having moved away from the past, a past that was painfully different from the present that we inhabit. Call Me By Your Name invites us to take this anachronism seriously and more broadly to consider the value of anachronisms. Here I should say that the specters of Call Me By Your Name are not kind of individualized sort of bodily entities. Rather, they are to be kind of found in what is really an affective dimension of the film. It's an affect that has something to do with a condition of unsettling otherness that kind of haunts this film. And it's a condition that seems concerned with the possibility that one may be, and most importantly, may be seen by others as different. And here, Jewishness is for sure one element of the kind of emanations of difference that, sorry, I thought it was a message for me, that's why I got distracted. So Jewishness is for sure one element of the emanations of difference that this film seems to discharge. But the anxieties about public recognition and visibility that we find in the film seems to insistently point to homosexuality. The love story in the film seems to blossom clearly without those fears and threats that we would expect from this type of story. And the innovative element for a film about the discovery of homosexual desire, at least on mainstream screens, concerns Elio. This very precocious 17-year-old who does not seem to be burdened, as we would expect from a youth of his age, by any sense of guilt, right? Any fear in accepting his own homosexual desire. He's actually the one who's going for it. But there is a moment in the film where something changes. It's a change in tone related to the emergence of this strange dark affect that all of a sudden strikes Elio. And I think it's a change in tone that causes a regression in this character, and a regression or a change in tone that are kind of inconsistent with his characterization up to this point as this very precocious, unapologetic teenager. So this dark affect that seems to combine feelings of shame, loathing, and fear does not strike just Elio, but seems to invade the formal and libidinal fabric of the film, starting from immediately after the sex scene between Elio and Oliver. Really, the sex scene is a turning point in the film. It's the moment in which homosexuality as a mode of desire and a possible way of life seems to materialize for the first time as a plausible alternative to heterosexuality, which is up to that point the dominant mode of the film. Now, of course, up until that point, homosexual desire is anything but absent. It's really everywhere, right? Inscribed in the image, in the camera work. Yet, during the first part of the film, homosexual desire is relegated to kind of being a discrete presence, while the scenes of public heterosexual coupling dominate the screen. So Oliver and Chiara, Marzia and Elio, and so on. And this is what is perhaps so charming and potentially queer about the film. That homosexuality is repeatedly conjured up, but never explicitly acknowledged as such, or named as such. And you may remember the ballet-like scene of the War Memorial. And this sort of pas de deux around the monument, which really mirrors the characters, the two protagonists, rhetorical circling around the topic of their conversation, which is Elio's desire for Oliver, therefore, also homosexual desire. So to make sense of the dark affect that seems to infect the film, kind of spread through the film, it's worth, highlighting this distinction in the kind of textual economy of the film. Call Me By Your Name presents heterosexual desire in an explicitly public manner, in certain cases almost vulgarly public, and we can talk about those later. By contrast, the film pushes homosexual desire to be this kind of ephemeral presence. And this textual economy is directly tied to really the idealized frame of the film, in which homosexual desire is inserted. It's a frame stuffed with references to classical and humanistic culture, where homosexuality occupies a central position. It's part of an ethos, but where it must submit to certain mandates. The intercourse, the first night between Oliver and Elio, disrupts things, right? And really, it represents a threat to disorder. And it's in response to this threat that the dark affect seems to spread through the film. And the film does this by imposing certain inevitable kind of conditions of plausibility in the story that lead to the preventive closure of any really alternative paths to the protagonist. So here affect works through narrative and dialogue. As an example of what I'm saying, I will show you the scene outside the kiosk that takes place the morning after the first night together. I invite you to pay attention to the way in which the film really seems to insinuate the idea that these two young men have done something wrong. You know, Oliver will say, I don't want either of us to pay for this. And then, you know, the rest of the dialogue normalizes really this idea that they've done something wrong. So Oliver says, whispers really, I'll kiss you if I could. He whispers those words. And, you know, we may scream asking, why can't you? But we don't, right? Because we all know why. And the film knows it as well. So the dark affect that starts infecting the film materializes also through a change of the kind of temporal register of the film. In the second half of the film, a sense of closure really strikes the story. Immediately after sex, the first night between Oliver and Elio, Elio asks Oliver whether he will give him as a present the shirt, his shirt, before his departure at the end of the summer. That's the shirt he has just used to wipe some sperm off his chest. So the piece of clothing really absorbs or cleans up the homosexual act, literally. And, you know, if you follow this reading of the film, also perhaps metaphorically, because, you know, the shirt may be said to foreshadow the purging operation affected by the film in the second part. And this is not by chance. This is not by chance the first time that Oliver's departure gets mentioned. In the following scene, the father Sam tells the mother that Oliver will leave soon to go to Bergamo to his research. So in a chain effect, the film suddenly confronts the viewer with Oliver's immediate departure, the end of the summer, the end of the vacation, and above all, the end of the love story. So all of a sudden, the film has this kind of ticking bomb on its neck. It would be strange to talk about time and to say nothing about the 1980s setting. Several commentators have lamented the lack of any explicit references to the AIDS epidemic. They want them to be explicit, but really, you know, if you look closely, you will find something. In an article that came out last year, Carl Schoonover and Rosalind Gold have brilliantly, I think, shown how a condition of anticipation kind of lingers in a very sort of eerie way over the film. And of course, anticipation is a crucial sort of temporal mode within the spectrum. So Schoonover and Gold have identified certain anachronisms within the film, such as the Mapplethorpe poster in Elio's room that we find at the beginning of the film. And these anachronisms, they argue, raise the specter of AIDS as a haunting from a future to come, one that as spectators, we are invited to recognize from our point in time. So through such anachronisms, Call Me by Your Name seems to evoke a time just before it would become impossible not to mention AIDS, while also cueing the after, right? The temporal foreclosing that this dark future will eventually bring. And we could think of this foreclosing as alluding to the traumatic end of gay liberation with AIDS. AIDS may well be the one specter haunting the film, but only, I think, insofar as it conjures up a material lived experience of injury for a generation of homosexuals, not only, and really a deep-seated trauma in the collective psyche of subsequent generations. In this sense, the other specter, the other ghost of the film, the one that haunts most jarringly Call Me by Your Name, may be homosexuality itself. Therefore, I would like to suggest that we think of these images of a sinister tone. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. I'm referring to the spilling of the blood from Elio's nose, but also this hip wound, Oliver's wound, about to get infected. So I'd like to suggest that we think of them not just as spectral references to AIDS, as some commentators have argued. These images have a kind of mystifying qualities. The narrative meaning is never really explained or justified. Though they seem to function as red flags, right? Forecasting a kind of danger. In classical film narration, the function of these red flags is to anticipate a turn of events, right? Preparing the viewer for a moment of crisis. Here, through these images, the viewer, consciously, unconsciously, is invited to contemplate the possibility of a danger that risks attacking this state of harmony. And based on this classical narrative model, so the spectator is pushed to expect that something bad will happen soon to these two. Now, nothing of this sort actually happens. The two are not discovered by anyone. There's not a homophobic attack. Yet, the red flags kind of surreptitiously produce an effect, a warning. They really anticipate a tragic outcome that removes homosexuality from the realm of possibility, disempowering it and barring it from the idealized frame in which he resided from the beginning of the film. As the character of Mafalda says through the voice of the narrator in the novel, anticipating the worst was certainly a way of preventing it from happening. Now, in Call Me by Your Name, in the film, anticipation seems to be the narrative form of a future that never realizes itself. And here are my conclusion. Call Me by Your Name seems to construct a fantasy, a fantastic world without visible signs of homophobia, prejudice, a world in which parents can even encourage their 17-year-old to have sex or to pursue the experience of first love with an older man. But at the same time, the film demonstrates really the impossibility of this dream becoming a concrete reality. The final long take, however, contradicts this digressive push. The camera here remains stubbornly on Elio, while he contemplates, in tears, the conclusion of his love story. And here, this last shot, for sure, lends itself to a universalizing reading, according to the traditional schema of the coming-of-age story. The painful long take on Elio becomes the moment in which kind of the grief and the knowledge of the loss leads to a process, or eventual process of maturation. And this painful long take, I think, also contains something else. In those tears, there is also something more specific. Something kind of well known by many homosexual youths, and not only, kind of that stifling pain the one experiences in realizing that all options in front of us have been made unavailable. It's not so much Oliver's abandoning Elio that makes these boys' crime so desperate. Rather, the film has taught Elio that the homosexual lifestyle is too risky, and therefore, in a way, perhaps impractical, or impracticable, that's the word I wanted. And here is the other path of formation for Elio. As D.A. Miller has argued, in this final long take, we confront the ghost of the homosexual man that Elio might never be. I'm paraphrasing, perhaps, Miller. Judith Butler writes that the assimilation of the particular into the universal leaves its trace, an unassimilable remainder, which renders universality ghostly to itself. This trace is perhaps also what the final long take obliges us to contemplate. It's the ghost of a difference that the film tries to silence, but that inevitably kind of haunts the universal story. And Call Me by Your Name seems aware of this irony. The film seems to instruct us about the futility of a diluting impulse that attempts to make homosexual conditions like any other conditions. Last paragraph. If queer universalism, in its most utopian articulation, describes a radical impulse of generalization, rejecting minoritizing logic of tolerance and political interest representation, Call Me by Your Name tells us another, perhaps more inconvenient, present time story, one in which homosexuality as a form of desire and as a potential way of life lingers in our collective consciousness as an unsettling alterity. There might be something disappointing here. This seemingly anachronistic structure of feeling that stubbornly inhabits the film may, however, I think, be redeployed to really reflect on the ineffectiveness of the progress narratives that, willingly or not, inform our understanding of cinematic queerness in relation to the present and to the kind of film histories that we write. Thank you so much.